This section is on historical voting rights in the United States. The well-known and popular phrase, "all men are created equal," comes not from the Constitution, but rather from the Declaration of Independence of July 4th, 1776. The precise words are as follows: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." When the Constitution was signed, only white males over 21 years owning land could vote. There was at this time no reference to whom could vote in the Constitution itself. Voting rights were left to be defined by each state, most of which limited this right again to white males owning land. For a nation seemingly built on the equality of men, and this statement refers to men as opposed to women, all men were far from treated equally. Blacks, whether slaves or not, as they were at the time, free blacks in the northern states were not allowed to vote. In 1789, when George Washington was elected president, only 6% of the population could vote. In 1856, North Carolina became the last state to eliminate the requirement to own property to be able to vote. With respect to black voting, it was not until after the Civil War in 1870, by the 15th Amendment, that the Constitution was amended to allow all persons, regardless of race, to vote. But even then, women were excluded. This being said, voting regulations as to who were allowed to vote was left in the hands of the states, many of which devised literacy and other tests designed to preclude blacks from voting. With respect to the right of women to vote, that was followed by the 19th Amendment in 1920 that gave women that right. The 26th Amendment reduced the voting age to 18 in 1971, primarily as many young men were dying in Vietnam and were yet unable to vote. In 1876, the Supreme Court ruled that Native Indians were not citizens and hence precluded from voting. This was followed by a statute passed the following year which allowed Native American whites the right to vote, provided they gave up their tribal affiliations. This was followed by legislation in 1890, the Indian Naturalization Act, which granted citizenship to Native Americans whose applications were approved. In 1919, Native Americans who served in World War I were also granted citizenship. In 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act granted citizenship to Native Americans, but many states nonetheless made laws and policies which prohibited Native Americans from voting. In 1947, Miguel Trujillo, a Native American and former Marine, sued New Mexico for not allowing him to vote. He won his case. New Mexico and Arizona were then required to give the vote to all Native Americans. In 1922, the Supreme Court ruled that people of Japanese heritage were ineligible to become naturalized citizens. In the next year, the court found that Asian Indians were also not eligible to naturalize. In 1925, Congress barred Filipinos from U.S. citizenship unless they had served 3 years in the Navy. It was not until 1952 that the McCorrin-Walter Act granted all people of Asian ancestry the right to become citizens. It may seem hard to believe, but people living in Washington, D.C. have no elected representatives in the House of Representatives or the Senate. It took a constitutional amendment to get them the right to vote for president by the 23rd Amendment as late as 1961 yet.